Hi everyone, hope you're all doing well in the midst of final exams. Me, Jiwon, and Grace will be one of the last presenters this semester, so hang on, we're very close to the end. And today for the class we will cover 4 readings: The Magic of Diasporas and The Power of Tribes from The Economist, Radical Right Populism and Immigration Policy by Martin Shane, and last but not least, something a bit more exciting, Global Organized Crime by James Mitzelman. I will be starting with the positive and more open-minded side of today's topic. I'm sure many of us have heard either in Korea or elsewhere when it comes to international students how immigrants are a huge talking point. Politicians often use populism mixed with pseudo problems generated against immigrants to gain support. And we all know people like to have a so-called black sheep towards whom they can direct what are actually their own internal problems. But in contrast, the Economist articles actually debate against such negativity and bring out examples for how migration actually benefits us all around the world. In the article, The Magic of Diasporas, it was written that the growing economic importance of diasporas and the contribution they can make to a country's economic growth is a factor that should and is actually being considered as a factor nowadays. But jumping a bit back, let's also define what this word diasporas actually is. A diaspora is a scattered population whose origin lies in a separate geographic locale. So historically, the word diaspora was used to refer to the mass dispersion of a population from its indigenous territories. But such networks have been a considerable economic force for ages. But as we all know, the ease of modern travel has made it even more enormous. There are now 215 million first-generation migrants around the world. That's 3% of the world's population. And there are more Chinese people living outside China than there are French people in France. Can you believe that? And then small concentrations of ethnic and linguistic groups in weird, unexpected places. For example, there are large communities of ethnic Estonians. I'm Estonian myself, in Northern America, and they might make up a lot more than Estonians in Russia, which is a country right next to Estonia. And I'm sure we can all put one and one together that such migration took place due to Russia and Germany during the last centuries. Anyways, going back to how is migration beneficial? Anyone who has taken Professor Pian's course of Introduction to Business knows this very well. It's because of culture. So networks of kinship and language make it easier to do business across borders. A good example from the article was written how a Chinese trader in Indonesia who spots a gap in the market for cheap umbrellas will alert his cousin back home who knows someone who runs an umbrella factory. So kinship ties foster trusts, so they can seal the deal and get the umbrellas to Jakarta before the rainy season ends. So here, trust matters, especially in emerging markets where the rule of law can be weak, and most of the time is. So does a knowledge of the local culture. In this, it makes sense as to why so much foreign direct investment in China still passes through the Chinese diaspora, right? Culture ties matter in business because they lower transaction costs. Tribal loyalty fosters trust. Cultural affinity supercharges communication. And reading a contract is useful, but you also need to be able to read people. In the Power of Tribes, Chinese culture network is called the Sinosphere. It is the most vibrant and oldest of such networks, and as by today, as some 7 million ethnic Chinese live outside mainland China, and together they connect China to every corner of the world. And as I said before about the FDIs, most are received from places such as Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan, where ethnic Chinese are the biggest group. The overseas Chinese also spread China's global expansion. For example, Africa is started with Chinese malls that sell the latest gadgets from Guangdong. But moving on, other factors are that diasporas help spread ideas through people migrating for better education, and also help spread money as migrants often help companies in their host country operate in their home country. All in all, the point here is that the hostility and stating that migrants drain All in all, the point here is that the hostility and stating that migrants drain the welfare, live off of taxes, and at the same time their cheap labor will depress the wages of unskilled locals isn't quite the whole picture, but the rich countries would actually most likely benefit from looser immigration policies, as there are studies that show that while immigrants make up an eighth of USA's population, they founded a quarter of the country's technology and engineering firms. And the fear that the poorer countries would suffer due to people going away isn't true either, as skilled migrants send money home and they often return to set up new businesses there as well. In the second reading, The Power of Tribes, Mr. Cocking quotes a 14th century Arab historian. Only tribes held together by a group feeling can survive in a desert. Substitute globalized economy for desert, and this describes the modern world quite well. I feel like this fits here very well and concludes my part of the presentation. Now I'll give it over to Grace.
We will now be going into Martin A. Shane's report, Shifting Tides, Radical Right Populism and Immigration Policy in Europe and the United States. Populist radical right policies are characterized by a sense of exclusive nationalism, belief that national identity is under threat from foreign cultures, desire to sharply cut immigration, and a distrust of elites. Shane examines four societal drivers of support for radical right populism. The first is economic instability and the challenges of responding to this in a globalized economy. During economic crises, such as the 2008 crisis, European countries had limited policy options due to a dependency on globalized trade. With the asymmetric costs and benefits of the European project, opposition to it has grown amongst people who associate it with increased competition, weaker job security, and as challenge to national identity. In America, while the U.S.'s recovery from the 2008 economic crisis was relatively quick, nearly a third of the U.S. still feel the effects of economic loss. In both the US and Europe, populist radical right policies have benefited from public disillusionment. Anxiety from immigration and the pace of social change with growing religious and ethnic diversity also prompted support for radical right populism. In Europe, restricted entry of labor immigrants in the 1960s led to family reunification becoming a primary entry channel, increasing the population of immigrant families. In the US, however, through changes in immigration policy, there was an increase of Asian immigrants and Mexican and Central American immigrants who decided on permanent settlement. These shifts coincided with a steady increase in the share of Americans in favor of decreased immigration. Surges of immigration can also bolster support for radical right and anti-immigration policies. Terrorist attacks in Europe and the US has also heightened concerns about the radicalization of some first and second generation immigrants, despite the reality of very few of these attacks being carried out by people with an immigrant background. In Europe and the US, these economic and social changes untethered voters from their traditional party bases, then added new issues to the agenda. In Europe, ties between parties and the working class base became less secure and more conditional on their policy agenda. In the US, values of voters for each of the two major parties have demonstrated a growing polarization. The popularity and electoral success of candidates on populist radical right platforms can also be credited to changes within political parties. Particularly electoral breakthroughs in Europe in the mid to late 1980s are thought to have been possible because, for one, a new wave of populist radical right leaders were able to target a more volatile electorate. Also, young people who had come of age in the 1960s and 1970s held values that challenged the established left, especially voters of sectors that were the losers in the emerging economy brought by European unification and the globalization of trade. These changes reflect the weakening of ties to established parties and gaps between the mainstream political parties. However, despite the relative success in gaining votes, the impact of the radical right on immigration policy has been limited. Even where they are given more representation, they are less effective at governing and having an impact on developing policies. Instead, they more impacted the political agenda as their success made issues such as immigration to the forefront of policy priorities of other parties as they attempt to reduce the radical right's influence by adjusting their own strategies and issue agendas. When prospecting the radical right's future impact, Shane believes that two key dynamics limit radical right populism's prospects for future growth. One dynamic is the movement towards de-demonization or de-radicalization strategies, which are attempts to disassociate the party from extreme or racist ideology to appeal more extensively. However, this strategy can create internal divisions whilst being ineffective in winning voters or extinguishing opposition. Even if they were to succeed, or do succeed, the participation in government by the radical right parties tends to diminish their electoral support as they fail to deliver their campaign promises. The other dynamic is that, on the other hand, as electoral support for radical right increases, so does the strength of electoral opposition that seeks to block them from gaining seats or forming coalitions. Jane recommends 4 policies to minimize the potential negative impacts of radical right populist policies. One would be to create a coalition with radical right parties. Excluding radical right parties can risk further marginalizing populist radical right voters. Instead, enabling populist radical right parties to participate in coalitions offers a platform for engaging with their voters and recognizing their importance. Another would be immigration and to increase political mobilization of immigrants, and a whole of society approach, which is addressing public skepticism in a way that fully engages with citizens' concerns in a nuanced way across policy areas, and to rebuild economic confidence. I think that the main takeaway from this report can be summarized in this quote. Ultimately, radical right populism is not a pathology of a political system gone awry, but rather a manifestation of rapid and intense social change.
Hi, my name is Jaewon, and I'll be presenting on the reading Global Organized Crime by James H. Middleman for our presentation. To start with, I would like to give some information about the author, Professor James H. Middleman. Professor Middleman is a distinguished research professor who specializes in globalization and development, global political economy, and global governance. His works have had an emphasis on sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Asia, and he has worked for the United Nations and with several civil society organizations. Moving on to the first part of our reading, under the subtitle The New Criminality, Professor Middleman talks about how organized crime has transformed with globalizing tendencies which have emerged since the 1970s. What's more is that new forms of criminality were born, such as computer crimes, money laundering, stealing nuclear materials, and sophisticated fraud. Sophisticated fraud is described as the technological complexity among several parties using counterfeit bank instruments, credit cards, letters of credit, and computer intrusion and ingenuity of design. These include stock market pump and dump scams and pyramid schemes. These crimes happen between established codes of international law, challenging existing norms and infiltrate legitimate businesses and extend into international finance. What drives organized crime groups are the efforts to exploit the growth mechanisms of globalization. An example of global organized crime is related to Chinese immigration and the triads, who are Chinese criminal networks. The triads have had a business smuggling people to the US since the 1840s. The main reason why people smuggling has become a lucrative business is because of China's explosive economic growth related to its transition to the market economy. Millions of low-income farmers have been pushed off to make way for industrial projects. The surplus of workers would seek these immigration services, smugglers, to find a way to survive. Today, smuggling groups target these marginalized people and are globalizing their spatial domain. Smuggling operations are possible because of the powerful and wealthy criminals who have ties to corrupt state officials. The corruption of political authorities provide assistance in criminal activities by even providing legal protection for their criminal partners. Innovation in technologies and deregulations enable transnational organized crime groups. Deregulation also exacerbates this because it lowers state barriers to free flows of capital, goods, services, and labor. Transnational crime organizations are similar to global firms that operate in the global economy. Like global firms, transnational organized crime groups operate both above and below the state. On the above level, transnational crime organizations capitalize on permeable borders and deregulation. They embrace processes of globalization by creating demand for their services. They become actors in their own right, organized along zonal, regional, and sub-regional lines like the Golden Triangle. On the below level, as well as beside the state, they offer incentives to the marginalized segments of the population trying to cope with the adjustments cost of globalization. The marginalized represent labor supply in the form of social forces participating in the parallel economy of organized and unorganized crime and impairing the illicit channels of neoliberalism. Global cities act as the main loci of transnational criminal activity organizations. Hong Kong and Istanbul act as transshipment points, and New York, London, and Tokyo offer a collection of financial services which provides opportunity for disguising the use and flow of money and sources of technological innovations and advanced communications and transportation systems. Also, global cities are home to a large and diverse population, which allows criminals to blend into the legitimate institutions in ethnic neighborhoods. This poses a problem since police do not know the many languages and diasporic culture sheltering these criminals. Nigerian gangs in London and Asian gangs in New York exploit these advantages, which shows the embeddedness of transnational organized crime in neoliberal economic globalization. Just as the internet has increased connectivity and integration for legitimate businesses, the internet has also become a breeding ground for criminal activity. Cybercriminals can exploit inherent vulnerabilities in the electronic infrastructure of global finance through hacking for the purposes of theft, blackmail, and extortion. What's worse is that cyber gangs can assault a global city from virtually anywhere and remain anonymous, making it hard for a state to apprehend and prosecute them. In the last section of this reading, Professor Middleman talks about how globalized crime organizations weaken the very basis of government and constrains its capacity. Criminal elements do not seek to take over the state per se, but transnational and subnational criminal groups contest the rationale of the state, especially in terms of its legitimate control over violence and maintenance of justice. Criminal groups also are an alternative social organization that challenge the power and authority of the state by offering commerce and banking in black and gray markets that operate outside the regulatory framework of the state. These activities include buying and selling forbidden goods, providing discrete settlements and debt collections, and creating and maintaining cartels and arranging security for the protection of businesses. Organized crime groups can influence warfare and conflicts around the world. One instance is by tapping into the global systems of arms trade, which insurgents in different regions rely on. Many cases of war and conflict mask transnational organized crime. Somalia's violent conflict of clans are also brought about drug trafficking in khat, a drug that is a major element in its poverty-stricken country's deadly competition over resources. Lebanon, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan's fightings about religious differences and ethnic loyalties are similarly related to drug trafficking, which is a major source of revenue. These criminal activities seem to occur in states that are less autonomous with diminished ability to control borders. Traditional notions of jurisdiction based on territoriality are being challenged, and since new forms of criminality infringe on the principle of sovereignty.
So this concludes our presentation today. On the screen, you can see the discussion questions that you can answer. And thank you for listening, everyone.